This is the Flowering of the Middle Ages, History 4330, Week 12. Last week we had a lecture by Richard Armstrong on courtly love in Northern French literature, and he mentioned the Lays of Marie de France, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, including Tristan and Isolde and the Knight of the Lion, the Roman de la Rose, among other things, and the women he mentioned were Eleanor of Aquitaine and Marie de Champagne as sponsors of this literature. And so just to recall for a moment, this is Roland, the Song of Roland, which he really didn't mention. It was one of the forerunners of the courtly love literature in northern France, and Roland was mostly about men. And of course we saw a lot more women participating in the literature of northern France, and here we'll see this picture again, which I especially like because it sort of embodies courtly love literature and the theory behind it. And this, of course, is the Round Table of King Arthur, which is what this literature is essentially all about. And here are some scenes from Tristan and Isolde. Here is Tristan at the chase, and here is Tristan and Isolde. And, of course, Tristan here is being stabbed in the back by King Mark, who is his rival for the affections of Isolde. This picture recalls our miniatures from the Romance of the Rose, the Roman de la Rose, which is more idealized. And here is King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the marriage of King Henry and Eleanor. The second lecture we saw last week was Church and State by me. And we can recall parts of it: the two swords theory, the spiritual and temporal power, and the models for kingship presented by Constantine and Charlemagne. And remember that the rival theories were divine kingship, papal, and papal monarchy. Gregory VII, who was the originator of radical reform, was a pope, of course, one of the most important ones. Pope Innocent III represented the height of papal monarchy, and Boniface VIII represented the end of papal monarchy. Remember when he was captured and put into prison. Here is a diagram of spiritual and temporal power. And here is Constantine, who was the model that the kings all wanted to follow, including Charlemagne. Charlemagne himself was a model. This is the kind of kingship that the kings wanted. They wanted to see themselves as being crowned directly by God, whereas the popes wanted to take the role of St. Peter, and they saw themselves as crowning the kings and having the authority to crown kings and emperors. One theological theorist was St. Augustine of Hippo, who wrote The City of God. St. Augustine of Hippo lived in the late 4th and early 5th century, and the City of God represented the direction of medieval philosophy from that time forward. He was one of the greatest medieval philosophers. Another was St. Thomas Aquinas, and that is our topic tonight. Here is St. Augustine, a later picture of St. Augustine, and here is a diagram of his City of God. Tonight we're going to look at medieval philosophy. We're going to have a joint lecture by Cynthia Freeland from the Department of Philosophy and Michael Wishegrad from the Department of Religious Studies, and they're going to do a joint lecture on medieval philosophy.
The theme of my lecture for tonight, and the theme that both of us will be addressing tonight, is a theme of faith versus reason. And this is the critical issue that confronts many, many centuries of medieval philosophers and theologians. And we will be discussing two very prominent philosopher-theologians from the Middle Ages, but I am doing a sort of introductory section in which I set the stage by talking about what laid the basis for the conflict with religious faith in the three traditions of the West: that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we will both be dealing with the question of faith versus reason. And I have selected an illustration that, for me, epitomizes some of the tensions and paradoxes of the medieval philosophers who are dealing with faith versus reason. This is a 15th century French illustration, so it's beyond our time period, but it's an illustration of God creating the universe. And yet notice how God is creating the universe through the use of a compass, a kind of scientific tool that will make the universe rational and comprehensible to humans. The compass is something that's going to circumscribe God's creation so that we can see how it is indeed a good, fine, rational creation. So there's this tension epitomized in this illustration between religious faith, because of course creation is accomplished by a divine being, but also reason, because we need to make that religious faith intelligible to ourselves, and we need to be able to say why God's creation is a good creation. Just as a preview of our material for tonight, we will be talking about setting the stage. That's my job, and I'm covering about, I think, 1,300 years as compared to less than 100 that Professor Wyshegrod has. And then as part of setting the stage, I will talk about the ancient Greek philosophers. Then we will turn to the next part of our lecture, the really substantive central part, where Dr. Wyshegrod will take over, and he will do a presentation in the next part of the first half of your class on the great Jewish philosopher and theologian Moses Maimonides. And then after our break, I will return and I will talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian philosopher of the Middle Ages. So with that said, as a preview and as an overview of where we're going, I would now like to switch and set the stage, as your indication on screen suggests. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the ancient Greeks. Let me just ask you, how many of you have ever had a course in philosophy? Anybody ever read any of these ancient Greek? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle? Okay, it looks like some of you in the classroom on campus have at least, and I'm assuming that there's a reasonable share off campus as well. I see some grimaces out there, actually. Does not look like your experience was necessarily a good experience. There are three very prominent individuals we usually group together as the ancient Greek philosophers back in 5th and 4th century Athens. And these are Socrates, whose dates you see on the screen, 467 to 399 BC, and then his pupil and his associate Plato, who came in the next generation. And you can see he was roughly 40 years younger than Socrates, from 427 to 347. And then the next great philosopher, who is especially important for the medieval figures that we will discuss, namely Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil. And as you can also see, he came along and he was considerably younger than Plato, but he did come to Athens to study with Plato in Plato's school in Athens, the Academy. So we have a succession of three important Greek philosophers, and the reason why I'm going back and setting the stage by talking about them is because they lay out a picture of the world and a picture of God and a picture of the human soul that does not rely on any religious faith. And we will see that the medieval philosophers we're coming to study later on have to deal with this vision of the world as a confrontation with their own views, which do derive from various tenets of religious faith. Okay, so let me look at a key topic on which Plato and Aristotle differ. And we will see some fallout of this disagreement as we go on through our lecture today. I think that you'll be able to follow this out a little bit further. Plato and Aristotle disagree over the existence of what we could call forms. And just what forms are is a little bit hard to describe or to delineate, but a form might be something like beauty, as it is in and of itself, or it might be something like whiteness, or it might be something like the number 2, or it might be a quality like coldness, but I'm going to focus on the example of cat. And Plato and Aristotle disagree on the way in which a form is realized in a cat. So now I would like to switch, if we could please, to the screen on here where I have a wonderful illustration of two cats. And these are actual cats. Now, my artistic ability may be a bit limited, but let's look at the philosophical issue involved in differentiating between my cat, Fluffy, and my friend Pat's cat, Spike, who unfortunately suffered a bit of an accident in his young years, and the vet wanted to amputate the tail, but my friend Pat said, no, let's keep a bit of the tail. Now, here are two cats, and as you can see, they're quite different. Fluffy is sort of big and fluffy, as his name would suggest. And Spike is a tiger cat. Fluffy is a kind of white cat. And so the question that arises for philosophers is, how do the two of them differ? And what is their catness? How is cathood present in these two cats? And here's a really short, minimal answer that I've encapsulated on the bottom of my illustration. For Plato, forms are independent substances. That is to say, there is such a thing as the form of cat. It's a real entity, and it exists as an invisible, perfect, immaterial entity that can only be known through an abstract act of the mind. Whereas for Aristotle, forms exist only in particular substances that are concrete individuals, like my cat Fluffy. Forms are actually in substances. Now, you were doubtful about Fluffy, so I had to bring you my own picture of Fluffy. And this is just a little sample of cathood as it's exemplified in a concrete individual cat, my cat. And in this particular cat, Aristotle would say, you can learn about catness and cathood. The form of cat just happens to be qualified in this case by being white and being rather furry, and of course being cute, and unfortunately being a little bit slow, bred for beauty, not brains. So anyway, there's this disagreement between Plato and Aristotle on forms, and this will have implications for the two men's philosophies of God and their theories of God's role in relation to the cosmos. So I would like to switch now to that topic. Oh, some more cat pictures I have on my computer screen. Could we please go back to the computer screen? Just more examples of cats. I happen to be a cat lover, so I will pass on to Plato's theory of creation. Now, in Plato's theory of creation, there is a definite role for the forms, and that's what I would like to talk about, and I also want to talk about God, of course. Plato's account of creation may be found in a work of his called the Timaeus. And maybe some of you have read this work, but it's a somewhat obscure work of Plato's, so you may not have read it, even if you've read things that are more familiar, like his Republic. In the Timaeus, Plato does have a God figure, but this is a God that is usually called the demiurge after the actual Greek word demiurgos, which he uses in that dialogue. And the demiurge is a creator being, but the demiurge is not omnipotent, and the demiurge in particular does not create from nothingness. The demiurge works with the matter that's already there. And Plato calls this a sort of womb-like stuff that's very messy and chaotic, and he has a lot of sort of anti-woman sentiments that he puts in his remarks about this basic matter. It's unruly, and it's in need of order and rationality, and so the demiurge brings order and reason to the chaos of the receptacle and creates our universe by following all the forms as his blueprint that he will use to make a beautiful universe. So that is to say, there is a creator God, but he doesn't create the entire universe because the forms are already there before he is there, and also the matter is already there, but he sort of puts the forms onto the matter, so he takes the form of cat, and he works with all the material, and he makes individual cats, and similarly with the form of tree, dog, human, and so on. Aristotle's theory of creation and his theory of God is rather different, and this reflects his different view of what we would call in philosophy the ontology or the being of forms. Aristotle's theory of God is presented especially in two of his works, the Physics and the Metaphysics. And these are pretty dense, abstract works, so you may have read them before, but his theory of God is pretty notoriously abstract and difficult. And I'm just going to be summarizing it here so that we'll have a kind of comparison that we can return to when we go on to the medieval figures. Aristotle's view of God is this, and this is not very illuminating, is it? God is pure actuality. God has no potential, and that is to say that God is perfect. God is purely totally what he is. And this pure actuality has no possibility of change, because why would God ever need to change? God is already everything. And God has no ability to be affected by anything else. And this is also part of God's being a pure actuality. Along with being a pure actuality, God is a prime mover. And this is a concept that Thomas Aquinas will pick up on, and he will apply this to the Christian God when he comes along and he begins to synthesize Greek philosophical accounts of reason and God and the nature of God with Christian theological accounts. To say that God is a prime mover is to say several things: that God makes the whole universe have the order and the motions that it does. And finally, Aristotle's God has this as its nature. What could a purely actual being do? It is immaterial, it's perfect, it has no potential to change. The only thing that Aristotle can think of that's appropriate for such a perfect being to do is to do what philosophers do, right? Think. So Aristotle's God is a thinker. And then he has this puzzle that he deals with in his Metaphysics, and this is in Book 12 of his Metaphysics. What does God think about? And there's three options. What can God think about? Option 1, God thinks about nothing. Well, then God is stupid. And God might as well be asleep. So that's no good. Option 2, God thinks about us. But we're too low. You know, we're mere mortal creatures. We come and we go. We're imperfect. We're flawed. We have sins. We have vices. Well, we don't have sins according to Aristotle, but we have failings, And so God should think of something more lofty. So he can't think of nothing. He can't think of the rest of creation because it's beneath him. There's only one option left. And that's indicated here. God is thought thinking itself. God is thought thinking itself. So God is this activity of thinking all the time, thought thinking itself. Now, let's sum up what Plato and Aristotle agree on about God. They do have their differences about the forms, so that for Aristotle, the forms would almost be like the contents of God's thought. They aren't really out there the way they were for Plato's demiurge, but they do agree on many things. First of all, they agree that there is no creator God in the sense of the God of Genesis, who makes the whole of creation out of nothing. Now, there is a kind of creative agency in Plato's Timaeus, and I talked about that. That's the demiurge. But that creative agent does not create everything the way that God does in Genesis. Next, the two philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, do agree that there's no beginning of the universe. And they also agree that God does exist, but not as a person. Now, let me go back to the previous point. There's no beginning of the universe. The Greeks believed that if you were to try to pinpoint a beginning of the universe, the natural, rational question to ask would be, well, what was before that? And why did it begin then rather than at another time? And so they just accepted an infinite, eternal universe. And this universe was apparently coexistent with God, according to Aristotle, and coexistent with both the forms and the receptacle, according to Plato. And the final point they agree on, God exists, but not as a person. This thinking being that Aristotle has is not a father, not a loving God, not a God who would care about the fall of a sparrow or care about each and every one of you, and not a God who has a predestined plan for mankind. This is a God who's very lofty and who's just like truth thinking about truth. Now, the Platonic God is a little bit more like a person because he wants to do good things. He wants to make a good universe. But then again, that God is not like a fatherly, loving, caring being, a personal God like you have in the great Western religious traditions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Okay, so let me go on and summarize on the importance of the Greeks. They present some very significant challenges to the medieval faiths that are about to come on the scene a few centuries down the line. They put a great deal of emphasis on their faith in logic and rationality. So they will try to figure out what you could say about the nature of God based not upon any kind of prophecy or any kind of holy book or any kind of revelation on a mountaintop, but based on their own shareable human reason and logic. Similarly, they use science and they put faith on empirical evidence for various things. And next, they emphasize what we could call humanism and ethics. So just as there's no divine being who's the creator of the universe, who's telling us what to do and what our plan for life should be, so also there's no God giving us 10 commandments that are the basis for our moral life. Rather, we're supposed to use our reason and figure out what would a good life be. And if you've read works by Plato like his Republic, or if you've read Aristotle's Ethics, you can see how they go about this project of having a humanistic understanding of ethics. I've chosen to illustrate this point about humanism and ethics by selecting another image here. This is a Renaissance image depicting Socrates' death scene. And in this image, could we have the computer, please? Okay, good, thanks. Socrates' death scene. Socrates is the guy in the middle. And so Socrates, if I can get my mouse going here, whoops, I need to go back. Okay, Socrates is the one in the middle holding up his finger. And Socrates is supposed to be dying, but he looks pretty lively, doesn't he? Now, why is this? This is a depiction of Plato's own dialogue called the Phaedo, in which he told about Socrates' death scene. Socrates had to die by drinking hemlock, and all of his friends gathered together to talk with him on the day of his death. If you've read the Phaedo, you'll know about this story. And in the death scene, Socrates was asking the question, well, will I live after I die? And he was not looking for some sort of prophecy that would tell him the answer. He was using his reason to figure out if there is a soul, and he tried to think what a soul would be like, and would a soul be the kind of thing that would live on after death? And indeed, yes, he hoped that it would. And he said, either my soul will live on after death, or I will die, and that will be like going to sleep, and it will be kind of nice and relaxing, and I won't have to worry about it. So you get an illustration of humanism. There's no need to rely on kind of a promise of an afterlife, a hope for immortality, other than what our human reason can suggest. I have another image I'd like to switch to over here, please. This is a picture. I hope it will show up reasonably well on the screen. This is a picture that I took when I went to Greece. And this is a picture that shows Aristotle. And this is the statue of Aristotle that's there in Greece, in northern Greece, at his birthplace, which is Stagira. And I've chosen this picture because I thought it was a very beautiful place. And there were all these roses there. If you looked back behind the statue, you would see the cliffs that went down to the sea. And when I went there to visit, lo and behold, there was a little turtle walking along right by Aristotle's statue. And I thought how much that Aristotle would have liked that, because Aristotle was first and foremost a naturalist. So Aristotle really was quite skeptical about the possibility of a life after death, because he did take an empirical, scientific, biologically grounded approach to talking about many subjects, including the human being. We as human beings are biological creatures, just as are horses and cats. And unfortunately, we're all mortal. We all are subject to the diseases of the flesh. Perhaps part of us will live on, but Aristotle did not really hold out much of a hope for immortality and for religious faith. So Aristotle thought our world was a beautiful world. It was worthy of empirical study. It was worthy of study even down to little crawling things like centipedes, which he studied, and like tortoises, which I saw there at his grave. So now I would like to just finish up my portion of setting the stage in the beginning of this lecture by talking about what happened to these Greek philosophers and to their writings. And this will take us over a huge span of time in a very swift way. Some of this is material you may have studied in your texts or in your class already. Let me just try to fill in some of the broad picture about textual transmission. First of all, the Greek texts from Plato and Aristotle, Socrates did not actually write anything. The Greek texts were translated into Syriac and went over into the world of the near Middle East. And this was a fairly long phase that took some time up to about, let's say, the 400s AD. And then Muhammad came along, of course, in the around 600, and the Arab rulers became dominant, and they began amassing an empire, and they had the works translated. Sometimes it was from Greek, sometimes from Syriac, sometimes from Persian, sometimes from Hebrew, and they had works translated into Arabic. And this occupied some time up until the 700s and 800s. And then we had yet another phase of translation that finally brings these Greek texts around about through the near Middle East, back across Africa with the Moorish invasion of Spain, and gets them translated into Latin, which is the language that Thomas Aquinas will be reading them in. He could not read them in Greek. And this is happening around the 1100s and 1200s. So this is a sort of long sweep of history, and I've given you a bunch of dates. I see some of you are still writing the dates down, so I'll give you a minute more on these. But I also would like to give a little bit of a pictorial overview of this process of textual transmission. One thing that you should begin noticing, though, is that the Greek texts did not take a direct route from Athens into places in Northern Europe like Paris and London. This was quite rare. They took this roundabout, indirect route. So now let me switch. I can go back to that if you'd like and talk about it. What I would like to do is sort of try to trace this route of textual transmission. And so what we're going to do, I'll come back to this screen in a minute, we're going to see a transmission from Athens down to Alexandria in Egypt, which is a really important center of learning, and there's a library. And from Alexandria, many scholars, including doctors, came from the near Middle East over here and studied, and they would make copies of texts in the Alexandrian library of Greek texts, take them back. And also, back in Athens, Plato's school, the academy, continued all the way up until the 600s, when finally the Emperor Justinian closed it down to get rid of the heretics. So then lots of the people went from Athens and again went to the Middle East, taking texts with them. And then the texts come back from the Middle East, clear across North Africa and across into Spain, where they finally get transmitted and translated along the way into languages like Latin, where people in Paris up here in France could read them, and also people down in where Thomas Aquinas is from in Italy, Naples, could read them. So let me show one more screen, and then I'll come back to that screen. I've got another screen here that depicts the Middle East. And here's Egypt over here. I hope you can see up here. And so there's this great library in Alexandria, and works get transmitted from this library, and they go across over into places like Baghdad, and then get translated and copied and edited and so on and assimilated there. And so the medieval Muslim scholars actually saw some of these texts before they came back through the route of conquest. Let me go back and just do that map again.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
When they went up through Spain, did they go up through there while the Moors were still occupying?
Mm-hmm. So let me see if I can do this little drawing that I was going to try to work on. So we have this transmission from Athens down to Alexandria and across way over into Baghdad, which is now off my map. Then it comes back through Egypt, northern Africa, and across here, and finally to Spain, and then up, transmitted to places like Paris, and down to places like Naples. So there's this very circuitous and interesting route of textual transmission. Yes, there's another question. Go ahead.
Now, wouldn't any of these books or translations, wouldn't they have gone through like the Romans? Because I know the Romans, when they took over the Greek lands, they pretty much took everything they could back to Rome with them. So wouldn't some of that survived? And
there were some texts, but surprisingly few of the main texts of Plato and Aristotle that got preserved through that route. It's a sort of curiosity, and there are many speculative accounts of why that would be the case, but there were actually relatively few. There were some texts that were known and that were studied by the Roman philosophers, but really major texts like Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, which was his theory of science, or like his metaphysics, the really hard parts of his metaphysics, were not preserved through that route. Okay? I'm almost done, and then I'll pause again for some questions. So let me try to just sweep on, and I can then turn the floor over to Dr. Wyshegrad. I have a picture here of a scribe that I included just to remind you that this process of textual transmission is not done by Xerox machines, right? The process of textual transmission involved human beings who were sitting there copying texts by hand. And one thing that's really important to know is that sometimes the guys who were copying texts couldn't read the language they were copying. And so you have a situation where you have lots of text being copied by hand, and you have a lot of margin for error. So there are texts that are coming along through this route, and just think of the translations of translations of translations, copies of copies of copies. And so you get various versions of the works of Plato and Aristotle, including some that were later to be considered by scholars and editors not to be authentic. To conclude, I would like to leave you, whoops, went too far, with an illustration of a manuscript page just to highlight the individuality and the hand-done character of the medieval manuscript. Now, this happens to be a very lovely Latin medieval illuminated manuscript, and this is here in our collection at the University of Houston. But just to remind you that this is a process done by hand, carried out by individuals, subject to error, but along the way there were people who were coming to terms with these texts sort of bit by bit, religious tradition by religious tradition, and we're going to hear more about the impact of all of this as we continue. Let me pause for a minute. This ends my part of the presentation, and let's see if you have any questions for me while Dr. Wyshegrad gets ready to come up. Also, if there are any questions from off campus, I would be more than happy to hear from you all through the microphones as well. Anything I've just gone over way too fast here? I've summarized an awful lot in a very short time period. I'm hoping that you have some familiarity with Greek philosophers, have a little bit of a sense. We will have discussion at the end after Dr. Wyshegrad talks about Maimonides and I've talked about Aquinas. We'll come up together, and so we'll definitely have room to open the floor for questions then as well. Okay, well, I'm going to turn the floor over to you then, Michael.
Get myself organized here. Well, you've just heard a very rich survey of a great deal of Western civilization. And since our topic here is the flowering of the Middle Ages, I think it is probably good to start by repeating, and I'm sure you've heard this idea, that the Middle Ages are really a combination of two essential influences. One is the Greek philosophical tradition that you've just heard about in all its complexity and richness. And the other is the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition. The Bible plays a critical role in the two faiths that we will be discussing today, Judaism and Christianity. Now, of course, there is one faith missing here, and that is Islam. And in recent years, we have begun speaking about the Abrahamic Faiths. And that would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the term Abrahamic faith means that these three faiths all have a loyalty to Abraham, the Abraham of the Bible. They interpret Abraham in different ways, but Abraham is a crucial factor in all these three religions, and it is particularly crucial for Judaism and Islam. Now, Judaism and Christianity have a unique relationship, and that is that they share a Bible, the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Christianity, in addition to the Hebrew Bible, also has the New Testament, of course, but it is very significant to realize that a large part of the Bible is common to Judaism and Christianity, and that is the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. If you get a hold of a copy of the Bible that includes the Old and the New Testament, you will find that about 80 to 85% of it is the Hebrew Bible, is the Old Testament. So you might say that the overlap between the two faiths is approximately that amount. It is interesting to realize that while Islam is an Abrahamic faith, Islam does not recognize the Hebrew Bible as authoritative in its faith. From the point of view of Islam, the Hebrew Bible contains much truth, but it also contains a lot of error. The Hebrew Bible is the story as told from the Jewish perspective, and therefore it has many false themes and ideas. So the authoritative book from the point of view of Islam is the Quran. And therefore the relationship between Judaism and Islam and Christianity and Islam, while in many ways very intimate, is also different, because Judaism and Christianity on the one side and Islam on the other side do not share a scripture. So when a Jew or a Christian dialogues with a Muslim and quotes a verse from either the Old or the New Testament, this does not floor the Muslim. This does not, it is not authoritative for the Muslim. Whereas when a Jew and a Christian, when a Jew dialogues with a Christian, or when a Christian dialogues with a Jew, and one of them quotes a verse from the Hebrew Bible, that should be authoritative for the other, because they share this Bible. Now, having said that and focusing on the Bible, I think it is really more helpful to see the relationship of faith and reason in terms of the relationship between the Bible and Greek philosophy. The Jewish and Christian faith really means that both Judaism and Christianity accept the Bible as authoritative. And therefore a Jewish or a Christian thinker, in developing his ideas, must pay very close attention to what the Bible says about any particular issue, keeping in mind that when we use the word Bible, it means something different for Jews and something different for Christians. For Christians, it is the Old and New Testament, and for the Jews, it is just the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. You notice I sometimes speak of the Hebrew Bible and sometimes speak of the Old Testament. The term Old Testament is really a Christian term. For Christians, there is such a thing as an Old Testament because there is a New Testament. For Jews, there is no such thing as an Old Testament. There is only the Hebrew Bible. And in recent years, it has become customary to use the term Hebrew Bible rather than Old Testament, because that is simply an objective statement. When we speak of the Hebrew Bible, we mean that it is the Bible written in Hebrew, or almost completely in Hebrew. Some scholars speak of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible. Instead of using the term New Testament, they use the term Greek Bible because the New Testament was used in Greek. Now let us turn to Maimonides, who is our immediate topic of conversation here. Maimonides is a Jewish philosopher who was born in Spain, in Cordova, Spain, in 1135. He then had to leave Cordova in 1148 as a result of the Almohad conquest, the Almohad Muslims were a sect or a group of Muslims who were really known as being quite intolerant, in some ways rather different from mainline Islam, which in most instances was relatively tolerant of Jews and Christians. Jews and Christians in Muslim thought were referred to as the people of the book. And they had special rights in Muslim countries which others did not. The Almohads, however, were much less tolerant, and this made it necessary for many Jews who came under their rule to leave. So Maimonides left, and he travels his family, he and his family travel around, and they arrive in 1160 in Fez, North Africa. Now, the interesting thing is that Fez was also ruled by the Almohads. Yet it seems the Fez version of Almohad Islam was relatively more tolerant than the Spanish version. There is a great deal of speculation, though nobody knows for sure, that Maimonides' family during this period had to pretend to be Muslims and practice their Judaism secretly. Whether this is really true is not certain. There is a good chance that it is true. Maimonides and then moves in 1165 to Fostat, F-O-S-T-A-T, that is really near Cairo. It's a part of old Cairo, and he spends the rest of his life there, and he dies in 1204. Now, Maimonides performs for Judaism what later Thomas Aquinas performed for Christianity, and what earlier some of the Arab philosophers performed for Islam, and that is to fuse the Greek philosophical tradition and the biblical heritage. Now, for Maimonides, this meant the following. Maimonides was convinced that reason could establish certain fundamental truths which could not be contested. And this largely turned out to be the philosophy of Aristotle. Now, I would suspect that we today do not look to philosophy as establishing truths which are incontestable. But in the medieval times, the prestige of Aristotle was so great that many persons thought that the teachings of Aristotle were simply absolutely true and could not be contested. Aristotle was not even referred to often by his name. Writers would simply say, "The philosopher writes," and everybody knew who the philosopher was. It was Aristotle. So from Maimonides' point of view, that's one part of his worldview, namely the truth of Aristotle. The other side was the Bible, which was also authoritative for him. Now, given that situation, we have a situation of conflict, because as you've just heard, particularly on the issue of the nature of God, to start with, the Aristotelian idea of God and the biblical idea of God are quite different. The Aristotelian idea of God, as you just heard, deals with a God who is pure actuality, who is perfect, who does not change, who does not know what's going on in this world, because this is far too low and unimportant for his great thinking project. And the God of the Bible is a very human God in many ways. The God as depicted in the Bible has emotions. He gets angry. He then does things. Then sometimes he's sorry that he did them. The Bible explicitly says that God was sorry that he created man after he saw how human beings were behaving. Sometimes you can diminish God's anger by speaking nicely to him. When he gets angry, you say certain things to him, and then he calms down. So the God of the Bible is certainly very different from the very removed intellectual being of Aristotle. Aristotle's God is the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover means that he moves everything, but he himself doesn't move at all. He just sits there. And then everything else sort of flows towards him or moves towards him. But he certainly doesn't do anything like that. When you read the book of Genesis, God creates Adam and Eve, and Adam eats, and God says to him, you can eat anything you want, but you may not eat from this particular tree. And then you all know the story. Adam and Eve do eat of it. And then God, the Bible says, God comes down and he walks in the Garden of Eden, and they hear him walking. And then God says to them, where are you? Speaking to Adam. And Adam says, here I am. And then God says, I heard you ate of this apple. Now, I can't imagine the Aristotelian God engaging in this kind of enterprise. I mean, coming down from his lofty heights and calling to order people who have not obeyed his commands. So you can see the great difference between the God of Aristotle and the God of the Bible. Now, what do we do about that? You can see the problem that Maimonides has. Well, he solves the problem by taking advantage of the fact that in Judaism, the Bible comes with a vast body of interpretive literature. And this is Rabbinic Judaism. Now, Rabbinic Judaism consists of interpretation upon interpretation about the Bible. And therefore, the religious Jew, while he reads the Bible, reads it, by and large, through rabbinic spectacles. And part of this rabbinic view is that the Bible is not always to be taken literally. Common rabbinic saying is that the Bible speaks in the language of human beings, which simply means that the Bible uses human expressions that should not be taken literally. An example of that comes to my mind in the current situation. Today we speak of the sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening. Now, most of us know that the sun doesn't rise and doesn't set, that it's the earth that moves around the sun, yet we still use those expressions because they go back to a time when people thought that the sun was moving, and we just never got around to changing it. So we just use those expressions, and we don't mean for us to take them, for people to take them literally. Now, the rabbi said the same thing about the Bible. The Bible uses expressions, but you should not take them literally. So when the Bible says God came down in the Garden of Eden, this should not be interpreted literally as if he physically came down by means of an elevator or a parachute or some other arrangement of that sort. This is simply a way in human language of saying that God paid attention to this situation, to the problem that had developed with Adam and Eve. And and this helps Maimonides a great deal because it enables him to interpret the Bible not to conflict with his philosophic commitments. Now, what I have done is chosen 3 chapters from the Guide for the Perplexed, and let me move now to the Guide for the Perplexed. Can we have the picture now, the text? Oh, there it is. Okay. You will. The Guide for the Perplexed is Maimonides' major philosophic work. It was written for the perplexed. And who are the perplexed? The perplexed are Jews who are loyal to the biblical rabbinic tradition, but who have also studied Greek philosophy and been affected by it. And they are perplexed for the reason that we have just explained. They are perplexed because they learn one thing in the context of Aristotle's thought, and they learn something else in the context of the thought of the picture presented in the Bible. So Maimonides sits down and he writes this book. And I want to start by looking at a chapter in part 1. The Guide for the Perplexed has 3 parts. They are, this is not easy reading, but I have chosen part 1, chapter 57, and we look at some basic ideas in that chapter. Maimonides says in that chapter that existence is an accident superadded to a thing's essence. And here he is talking about things other than God. Let me first distinguish between essence and existence. And the essence of a thing is the answer to the question, what is it? So if I point to this object and I say, what is it? The answer is desk, and that would be the essence of this thing. It's a desk. Earlier we heard about the cat. The answer, when I ask, what is this animal, or what is this thing, the answer is a cat. That's the essence of it. Now, so the essence of anything is the answer to the question, what is it? Now, existence is another matter. There are some essences which exist, and there are some essences that do not exist. Example, the essence of my sister would be an essence without an existence. It is an essence because you know what I'm talking about, my sister. Now, it so happens, much to my regret, that I don't have a sister. So we are talking about an essence without existence. And the same is true of the concept of centaur, or a concept of a human being with 3 heads. I think there are no such living human beings. So we're talking about a non-existing essences. So there are 2 kinds of essences. There are existing essences and there are non-existing essences. So as you see on the screen, existence, says Maimonides, is an accident superadded to a thing's essence, by which he means some essences have existence added to them, some essences do not have existence added to them. And that changes in time. There was a time when the essence of my father existed. I unfortunately, that essence now no longer has existence because my father is no longer alive. So there are essences that exist and there are essences that do not exist. Now, next premise, God has no accidents. Now, what are accidents? Accidents are, there are two kinds of characteristics that things have: essential characteristics and accidental characteristics. Essential characteristics are those characteristics which flow from what they are. Or another way of saying it is to say that if they lacked those characteristics, they wouldn't be what they are. Now, there are some characteristics that a cat has, and if the cat doesn't have those characteristics, it's not a cat. Those are essential characteristics of cats. Then there are accidental characteristics of cats. Some cats are brown. Some cats are gray. Some cats have long hair. Some cats have short hair. Some cats are old. Some cats are young. Some cats are healthy. Some cats are sick. These are all accidental characteristics of cats, and that is the difference between an essential characteristic and an accidental characteristic. Now, says Maimonides, God, unlike all other things, has no accidents. Why not? Well, the answer is, if God had accidents, his unity would be diminished. Because an accident is, after all, something that can be added to the thing or taken away from it. A cat that is sick today can become healthy tomorrow. A house that is green today can become yellow tomorrow if you repaint it. So accidents come and go, and accidents are reflections of diversity or multiplicity. Next premise. God exists without possessing the attribute of existence. Now, question, is existence ever an essential attribute? Now, we already said that some things are essences with existence and some things are essences without existence. But is existence ever essential? And the normal answer would be no. In other words, existence is not essential to the concept of desk. We can have the concept of desk without that desk existing. So existence is generally an accident. Now, if God had the attribute of existence, he would have an accidental attribute. And that is not possible. Therefore, we must say, says Maimonides, that God does not have the attribute of existence. Question?
Yes, and this type of question bring out the question that God is dead.
It's a very interesting question you have. Notice the way Maimonides puts it. He says, God exists without possessing the attribute of existence. Here you see the tension. On the one hand, he does not want to say that God has the accidental attribute of existence. On the other hand, he cannot say that God does not exist. So he says God has a unique relationship between his essence and his existence. if you want to push it a step further, I think the way to see it is to say that in the case of God, existence, and this is true only of God, existence is part of his essence. It's not an attribute. If it were an attribute, it could be removed. Take me, for example. I am an essence who, at this moment, has the attribute of existence. But, question, can the attribute of existence, in my case, be severed from my essence? I'm afraid yes. How would that happen?
People will remember you after your death?
That's great. Well, if you kill me, or if I die of natural causes, if you kill me or I die of natural causes, then I will remain a memory, and I will be an essence without existence. There also was a time when I was an essence without an existence, so probably nobody knew it before I was born. So in my case, my essence is quite separable. Are you following me? My essence is quite separable from my existence. And that's true of any other thing. This desk can be destroyed. But in the case of God, the essence of God cannot be separated from his existence, says Maimonides. Therefore, we are dealing with a God who exists without possessing the attribute of existence. Now, later on, we are just on the edge of something that is called the ontological proof for the existence of God, which develops a little later, but the groundwork is laid for it in the philosophy of Maimonides in chapter 57 of the Guide for the Perplexed. Next premise, or shall we say next conclusion. God is one without possessing the attribute of unity. Now, since God possesses no attributes at all, and here we really come to the crux of this chapter, since God possesses no attributes at all, he also does not possess the attribute of unity. Yet he is one. And this is very important to Maimonides, because in Judaism and in Islam, the oneness of God is critical. In the case of Christianity, there is also a very important belief in the oneness of God, but the oneness of God in Christianity is, shall we say, supplemented by what? The Trinity. God is one and God is three. And as many scholars have pointed out, the Christian literature on the threeness of God is not 3 times greater, but 300 times greater than the Christian literature on the oneness of God. This is understandable because the Trinitarian doctrine is purely, typically Christian, and this is what has attracted all Christian thinkers. The oneness of God is, after all, a little outmoded. It is the Jewish idea, and we can leave the Jews to worry about that. Yes?
Did this bring about the wanting to have Jesus Christ as a Savior or Messiah from God to prove that his essence of existence?
No, I think from the Christian point of view, each person of the Trinity has existence and also has essence. And in addition, these 3 persons are one. This is really a very interesting company. I spent weeks on this in my course on Judaism and Christianity. We can't really go into that here because it's not directly connected with Maimonides, because Maimonides really doesn't deal with the Trinity at all. But it is necessary to understand that for Maimonides, the unity of God is very important. Now, what does this statement mean, there is one God? it means, well, it could mean a number of things. One thing it could mean is that there is only one God. There are not two gods, three gods, or four gods. But that is metaphysically less interesting, even though that is the part that has become so important. We use the term monotheism to refer to the doctrine that there is one God. We use the term polytheism to refer to the doctrine that there are several gods, more than one God. The metaphysically important part of the monotheism of Maimonides is the view that God's unity is absolute. Now, if God's unity is absolute, it means he has no attributes. And it means that we cannot use any human terms to refer to him. Because take a term such as merciful. If I say God is merciful, now Maimonides would say that sounds good, and it's the kind of thing that the Bible often says, but philosophers cannot accept that, and they must interpret that in some other way. Because, number one, if God is merciful, he has the attribute of being merciful, and that diminishes his unity. Then there are two things. There's the essence of God, and then there is the attribute of merciful. But that's already too much multiplicity for Maimonides. So Maimonides says you cannot and should not really say God is merciful. And at this point, he brings in his famous negative theology. What Maimonides says is this: instead of saying God is merciful, you should say he is not unmerciful, or he is not mean, or he is not unforgiving. If you keep it to the negative, he thinks you are much better off, because then you are not attributing something, you are denying something. You're saying God is not dead, God is not this, God is not that. But of course, this solution is not a perfect one, because logicians would say that the statement God is not unmerciful is logically equivalent to the statement God is the statement God is not unmerciful is logically the same as saying God is merciful, because the double negation ends up with a positive. If I say X is not non-P, then that's the same as saying X is P. But this is the best Maimonides can do, and the net result is that we emerge with a God who, and here I'm just expressing my opinion, who is really much closer to the God of Aristotle than to the God of the Bible. When push comes to shove, Maimonides has very deep loyalties to Aristotelian philosophy, and when something has to yield, it is really the Bible that yields. And he makes the Bible yield because he has this rabbinic, shall we say, freedom of interpretation. And that enables him to read biblical texts in less than literal ways. Now I want to move on to the next chapter, which is part 2, chapter 25. There we already heard about the question of the eternity of the universe. Aristotle teaches that the universe is uncreated. The Bible teaches that the universe is created. Now, what do you do with that? And here Maimonides comes out with something very interesting. He says this: if I, Maimonides, were convinced rationally that the universe is eternal, I would have no difficulty in reconciling that with the biblical account of creation. Given his freedom of interpretation, he would simply reinterpret the verses in Genesis to be compatible with the eternity of the universe. After all, let's face it, the Bible starts out saying, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, and the earth was in chaos, etc., etc. Bible doesn't say there was no primal matter there before God started creating. Now, if the Bible said that, that would make Maimonides' job a little more difficult. But the Bible doesn't say there was primal matter, and the Bible doesn't say there wasn't primal matter. So it says God created heaven and the earth. The medievals then added the concept of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. But this is not particularly explicit in the Bible. So Maimonides takes the position that if reason would prove that the universe is eternal, he would have no difficulty in making that compatible with the Bible. But fortunately, the universe has, the reason has not proven the eternity of matter. And of course, reason hasn't proven creation out of nothing either. Since reason is more or less neutral on the subject, he can stick with the biblical account of creation. But a basic point of this chapter is that the literal meaning of the Bible must yield to reason. And where they conflict, the literal meaning of the Bible must yield to reason without too much difficulty. Maimonides adds in the chapter that it is true that if matter were eternal, then that would imply a certain naturalistic frame of reference. He doesn't use the word naturalistic, but that is a word that I chose to summarize the position of Maimonides, namely that he writes this. This is a quote from the chapter. But if we assume that the universe has the present form as the result of fixed laws, there is occasion for the above questions, and these could only be answered in an objectionable way, implying denial and rejection of the biblical texts, the correctness of which no intelligent person doubts. Owing to the absence of all proof, and this is the critical issue here, owing to the absence of all proof, we reject the theory of the eternity of the universe. But it is only because the eternity of the universe has not been proven that we can reject it and stick with the more or less literal biblical text. So the rule is this: when reason compels us, we give up the literal meaning. When reason doesn't, we can stick with it. Okay, now I want to move finally to chapter 31. And there, Maimonides is dealing with the question of the law. When we speak of the law in the context of Maimonides, we are speaking of the Mosaic law. And I think we can get, there he is, Michelangelo's Moses. This, I cannot guarantee that this is an absolutely accurate portrayal of Moses, but it is the most widely accepted picture of Moses that we have in Western civilization. So there is, and it's interesting to note that the Moses of the Bible and the Moses of Maimonides both have their name as Moses. Maimonides argues that there are reasons for the commandments given in the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law is the law as we found it in the Hebrew Bible. There are stupid people who believe God's commandments have no rational basis. But Maimonides denies this. He says there is a reason for every one of God's commandments, and these reasons are rational. Thank you.